comfy valued at $49 absolutely free. That's 2 Forever Comfies for this crazy low price. Use one for the house and keep one in the car. Try them for yourself, and if you're not completely satisfied, send them back within 30 days for a full refund of the purchase price less delivery. Don't wait. Call or go online now and take advantage of our special buy one get one free offer while stocks last.
This week on Sports Night,
I think he's in and out of the stadium.
It's the business end of the Australian Open.
We'll see where it goes now.
I've had so much fun.
Who'll take home the chocolates for the first tennis major of 2014.
What a champion.
Utterly dominant.
I've got your cricket covered too,
Oh, caught it.
as the Aussies look to whitewash the one-day series as well.
What an innings, that was unbelievable.
And have we got the right mix for the Tour of South Africa?
Yeah, it is disappointing.
Everything counts, the whole package.
That's Sports Night this week on Sky News.
There's a lot of news that comes out of this place, and though we all focus on the headlines, there are stories that slip under the radar. That's the sort of thing we cover on Saturday Agenda. We try to dig a bit deeper, returning this week on Sky News.
Welcome to the program, our first for 2014. Well, our political leaders, the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader, have certainly returned to work this week with gusto. Tony Abbott has been at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And in fact, a little later this hour, we're going to take you live there because the Prime Minister will be delivering his keynote address. Bill Shorten, meanwhile, has been busy campaigning in the seat of Griffith, Kevin Rudd's old seat, where a by-election will be held in a few weeks' time. But the issues haven't changed a great deal over the summer break. Yes, the boats have all but stopped over the last 4 or 5 weeks. But asylum seekers has been a hot topic again this week, with claims of mistreatment that the government has denied, and also Indonesia's anger over the Australian policy of turning back asylum seeker vessels. To discuss the issues of the week and look ahead at the political year in front of us, we're joined tonight by Liberal MP Paul Fletcher, the Parliamentary Secretary for Communications. Julian Leeser is the former head of the Menzies Research Centre. Cass Wilkinson is from the Centre for Independent Studies. And Labor MP Nick Champion. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Let's start with boats. It's an issue that never goes away. The concerns Indonesia have been well expressed prior to the election and since about turning back the boats. Now that it seems boats are being turned back, they're making their opposition very clear, and they're also pointing to the incursions into their territorial waters that Australia had to apologise for last week. Paul Fletcher, how worried are you about Indonesia's anger?
Well, as the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have made clear, obviously, first of all, we respect Indonesia's sovereignty. Second of all, the relationship with Indonesia is of great importance to Australia. The Prime Minister made it clear that Indonesia is a priority for this country, and that was clear during the election campaign, and that's a consistent principle for us. Equally, Australia's sovereignty is important, and we have been very clear, the Coalition's been very clear as to what our approach would be in relation to asylum seekers. And what we've been doing is calmly and consistently acting in accordance with our stated policy, including turning back boats where safe to do so.
The thing that puzzles me is that it looked like boats were certainly slowing down. They've been slowing for some months and really getting down to a trickle. Why then do you need to turn back boats when it is something that's going to anger the Indonesians? We know Jakarta's position on this. Has it been really necessary to take that extra step?
Well, look, you know, I'm not going to get into the details of debating particular instances, and as the Minister Scott Morrison has consistently said, we're not going to disclose or flag to people smugglers what our operational plans are or how things are being conducted. But what I would say is we absolutely respect Indonesia's sovereignty, and also we've got a job to do, and we're being clear and consistent in the way we're doing it.
Nick Champion, Indonesia's upset, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of the election year politics in Indonesia has something to do with some of the comments that are being made. But boats haven't come for almost 5 weeks, and fortunately there haven't been any drownings for quite a while now, and we saw them on an all too often basis in years gone by. Is it worth just giving this policy a bit of a go to see if it can entirely stop the boats?
Well, look, I think what stopped the boats was offshore processing, and that was what was done, you know, as one of the last acts really of the Rudd government was to put in place the transfer arrangements with New Guinea. We wanted to put in transfer arrangements with Malaysia, but that was blocked by the Parliament by a strange alliance of Liberals and Greens. But I guess, look, our concern is the Australian people don't really know what the government's doing up there. Now, they say they've got good reasons for that, but there is a lack of transparency. And I think the secondary problem is we do have this issue with the government's rhetoric is somewhat confused. One minute they're telling us that Indonesia is a very important relationship. Tony Abbott chose it as his first visit. There's all this sort of very calm rhetoric from the very competent men of government, like Paul. But then you have, you know, in the very next instant, sometimes in the same conversation, you know, sort of diplomacy with a loudhailer and with a megaphone. And I think that that's encouraging a sort of a response from the Indonesians as well. That's not what we want out of this relationship. We want a relationship where politicians talk to one another face to face and institutions discuss things with each other. We don't want, you know, megaphone diplomacy across the Timor Sea.
Cass, how do you see this? There's long been and there still is very strong support in Australia for stopping boats. Nobody wants to see the tragedies we saw. And a lot of Australians don't want to see asylum seekers coming this way at all. But I think there's also a strong support for a healthy relationship with Indonesia. They're such a close neighbour, an important neighbour, an increasingly important neighbour. What's the balance here?
Well, I just think it's a real shame that all of our energy and attention, and the energy and attention of our leaders and our senior commentators in this country has been taken up with quite a very small part of the refugee problem.
But it's one that's inflaming an important relationship.
Well, I guess I see that Indonesia, like most poor countries, gets upset when they carry the burden of the global refugee problem and they see the rich world doing less than it could to ease that problem. There are millions of people in camps with no hope of being rehoused somewhere safe and prosperous and democratic. Australia has the opportunity to ease a great deal of that burden, and instead of talking about a couple of hundred poor tragic souls who come here every year on boats or try to, this country really should be talking about taking a couple of 100,000 people from the camps in the world where they're sitting around waiting in vain often for the hope of starting a new life.
But let's be clear, first of all, it was over 50,000 illegal boat arrivals in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years. So when Cass says a couple of hundred, it was over 50,000. So the government had lost control. The Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government lost control of Australia's borders. It's also important to remember that the Australian people expect the government to have control of who comes here, the democratically elected government, and it's also important to recognise that confidence in our broader immigration program, which is so important to Australia's economic future, is dependent upon, in part, the Australian people being satisfied that there's a process to determine who comes here. Now, there's well over 200,000 people who come each year as permanent residents or on various kinds of visas. We're one of the great success stories of the world in terms of bringing people from all around the world.
To Cass's central point, and I think you used the figure of hundreds of thousands we should be taking. I don't think either side of politics is going to go at that number, but is there a case for increasing the refugee intake?
Well, again, the point here is that the refugee intake has, in the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd years, much of that was taken up by people who arrived by boats and subsequently came in under that component. And that meant people sitting in camps, the very kind of people who Cass has talked about, went to the back of the queue and missed their chance because it was that same quota for genuine refugees that was being used up.
I may say the reason that the queue is not really a queue, it's a queue implies that if you stay in there and do the right thing, as Tony Burke said, the right way to come to Australia is to go to a camp and report to the UN, which would be nice if those queues were moving, but they're generally not moving because there isn't enough room being made in the destination countries. There are you know, the countries in the world who have accepted more refugees than us tend to be poorer countries than us. And I just think it's a shame that both sides of politics, in fact, let's count the Greens in as well, who haven't been shy about making political mileage out of this issue, we've distracted the whole country's attention on the issue of boats instead of talking about what does a prosperous, democratic, free and wealthy country do to make the moral contribution to the bigger global problem.
Well, the reason we're not having that debate, though, is the lack of public confidence that we can handle the boats that are coming and the immigration that's coming in this way as it currently is. On the point of poorer countries, in relation to Indonesia, you have fewer boats going to Indonesia now to use it as a staging post to get to Australia, in part because of the new policy. I think it's much better overall. I agree with you. I think we should increase the humanitarian intake, not to the levels you're talking about, but certainly we should increase it. But you can't increase it if there's no public confidence that the government can control.
To that point you raised there, if you're coming into Indonesia seeking transit here to Australia, that's a good thing for Indonesia, surely too. But what do you then put down the current attitude in Jakarta to?
Well, look, I think you were right when you said earlier that, we have to remember that Indonesia is in an election year. No Indonesian politician has ever lost votes by having a go at an Australian government. I also think we have to remember that the media environment and culture in Indonesia is very different to the way it is here. People interview judges in the middle of trials there. Politicians comment on all sorts of things all the time. I believe that there is behind-the-scenes diplomatic efforts. You've got General Molan and General Lay, who've been appointed as people who are dealing on behalf of the Prime Minister with the Indonesian government quietly. You've had many meetings between the foreign ministers there. I think you've got to see it in the context of the election.
Based on what we're seeing at the moment?
Well, look, I think the success of this program will be judged in the medium to long term. If you look at General Campbell's discussions about what's happening at the moment with Operation Border Security, he said the key point will be the end of March, at the end of the monsoon season. You're going to be able to properly assess
I don't think anyone's claiming victory. What about the claims this week of Navy personnel forcing asylum seekers to burn their hands by holding onto a hot engine pipe? The government and Navy have dismissed that. Nick Champion, how did you view these claims?
Well, look, in the last Parliament I served on the Christmas Island Tragedy Committee, and we had evidence in that committee of Navy personnel risking their own lives to save asylum seekers, which is, I think, a point made by Admiral Griggs this week. Look, our Navy personnel are very professional. All the ADF personnel and customs personnel up there serving on these operations are very professional.
So you would doubt these?
Well, I'm inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to the Navy, and they have their own processes to make sure that the highest levels of professionalism.
And they also record,
and if you look at the track record, it's very, very good.
They also record these incidents pretty forensically too themselves, so you would think there would be, if not video evidence, then something.
And if we had the same level of transparency that we had, previous government, that would be demonstrated to the Australian public.
You reckon that should be made public? Any evidence?
Well, I think, look, I'll leave that in the government's hands, but I'll just make that point. Now, the other point I'd make just about some of the points made before. Look, nothing stopped the pipeline to Indonesia, like the Indonesian government's actions to stop visa on arrival for people, in particular from Iran. That's what stopped this pipeline of people seeking asylum into Indonesia and then to Australia. And that was done in cooperation with the Indonesians. Again, an action, in sort of cooperation with the Rudd government. So it was really those two things, just offshore processing and stopping these visas.
He's really rewriting the historical record here, because what he's neglecting...
just being accurate.
Well, what you're neglecting to go to is the fact that...
You want to put the top brick on this problem and say you did it.
When the Rudd government came to power in 2007, it reversed the policies of the Howard government,
which you consented to in the Senate.
Which had sorted
out
this
Paul Fletcher,
problem.
In the last act, as Nick Champion referred to it, one of the last acts they did put in place, and Kevin Rudd did negotiate not just offshore processing that John Howard had in place, but offshore resettlement, and that's been important, hasn't it?
And what a shame it was that we spent nearly 6 years going down the wrong path.
Paul, do you think that John Howard lost control of Australia's borders? Because in 2000 and 1999, nearly 20,000 people came to this country. Nearly 20,000 people came. In 1999, and in the year 2000, 20,000 people came.
Let's fast forward 15
Under your
years
rhetoric,
to today. Cass, just back on the claims that have had a lot of media interest this week about the burnt hands. What did you think of that and the way it was dealt with by the government?
I think that desperate people often make claims in difficult circumstances. I don't want to judge the people who made those claims too harshly, but the Australian Navy has a reputation for being a highly professional military, and as you say, I would absolutely give them the benefit of the doubt.
It's also, in a sense of logic, hard to understand how you could actually force anyone to hold on to something that's burning that badly. Physically, it's hard to...
Absolutely. I think we have to remember that, as Cass says, these are desperate people, and there are a lot of people who want this to fail who are involved in the smuggling racket, be that the unfortunate people who have been the clients of the smugglers, people who bring them on the boats, the people in Indonesia. And so there's a real interest for them in trying to chip away at this particular policy that the government's
I think that's a very important point that Julian makes, that the people smugglers have a very strong economic interest in the status quo that applied under in the Gillard-Rudd years remaining, and we've said that we intend to stop the boats, and while we're certainly not claiming victory, there's a long way to go, but there has been progress made, and that is bad news for criminals who make lots of money out of transporting people to Australia. So there are certainly people who have a strong incentive to be trying to cast fear, uncertainty and doubt in this area.
Just one final quickish question on this issue. Nick Champion, do you still oppose a turn back of boats?
Well, that's the party's policy, as I understand it. Well, look, I guess I always regarded the turn back as a sort of it's an issue that inflames our very important relationship with Indonesia, and there is a chance that it will start to define it the way we're going. So there is that very big problem with it. However attractive it might be, in the immediate terms, both politically and in other ways, I think it might cost Australia a great deal in the long term, and I don't think it's the main game. The main game was really offshore processing, which we wanted to institute with Malaysia years ago, and this stopping of the pipeline of people flying into Jakarta. That's what they were doing. But the one point of flying in, and when those visa arrangements were changed by Indonesia, that was the beginning of everything slowing down.
Okay, but right now the only policy difference that I can see is this turn back of boats.
It's temporary protection visas as well.
Well, there is that too, you're right. But on turn back of boats, are you willing to withhold judgment on this and see how it goes?
Well, we don't know how it's going because there is no transparency, and that's an issue in itself. I guess, you could say we'll wait and see how it goes, but we won't know how it's going.
We will eventually.
My point would be that the numbers were coming down. The numbers were coming down because they got the message. Australia, the Parliament, had acted to basically put in place offshore processing. We'd stopped the pipeline going into Indonesia. Those numbers were were coming down very quickly. We now see the coalition basically putting the top brick on a wall and saying they created the whole thing.
Oh yeah, you'd solve the problem. There's nothing to worry about.
We've got to take a break and move on to some other issues.
The revisionism of water the night goes.
I want to look at the big challenges ahead for both sides in this year. Stay with us.
Commence conformity protocol. Engage vehicle distribution.
It's in your pocket.
Level 5 offline.
Introducing the all-new Infiniti Q50. Follow your heart, not your neighbour. Search Infiniti Cars.
Before investing $1 million in shares, consider Gavin Ross & Co. Over longer and shorter periods, the average Australian share portfolio with Gavin Ross & Co. outperformed the ASX All Ordinaries. I sincerely recommend Gavin Ross & Co.
We focus on investing our clients' money to maximise performance via superior value analysis. We're deliberately different. Call Gavin Ross & Co. for a personal consultation.
There's an infinite number of ways to travel the world. Let Zuji be your finder, and you'll get the flights, hotels, and holidays you're really looking for. Your perfect trip is waiting for you. Book online today at zuji.com.au.
The world abounds with many delights, magical sights, fanciful flights, and those who dream on beautiful nights dream of beautiful things. The world is full of beautiful things, beautiful people too, beautiful people like you.
Slippers, mate. Mate?
No one likes fungal nail infections, but now there's a file-free solution. New Rejuvenail kills the fungus without needing to file your nails first. New Rejuvenail. Do your nails a favour.
With greatness comes great expectations. Expect more intelligent technologies, more refined luxury. Expect more performance. Introducing the all-new BMW X5, driven by great expectations.
Can the PM make the practical difference he's hoping for in the global economy? With Australia chair of the G20 this year, Mr Abbott's begun 2014 on the world stage at the Davos Economic Forum in Switzerland. Full coverage on AM Agenda and throughout the day on Sky News.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking tonight to Liberal MP Paul Fletcher, Julian Leeser, the former head of the Menzies Research Centre, Cass Wilkinson from the Centre for Independent Studies, and Labor's Nick Champion. I want to turn to what will be the big issue this year, and that's going to be the budget. How to get it back under control. There's a Commission of Audit process underway, and the Treasurer, Joe Hockey, will announce the cuts on budget night in May. The economy is at a delicate point, I think it's fair to say. We saw some very strong inflation figures yesterday. Housing prices are starting to really pick up in big cities in particular. But, you know, some sectors, and manufacturing, Nick Champion, as you know, doing it pretty tough still, even though the dollar's coming back down, fortunately for them. Is now the time to be making budget cuts, Paul Fletcher?
Well, we absolutely need to get Labor's debt and deficit under control. We're heading towards debt of $667 billion on the figures just before Christmas. We've inherited deficit after deficit after deficit from Labor. And that is important not just because the government needs to live within its means, but also because of the broader economic consequences.
So now's probably not the best time to go ahead with a $200 voucher for new couples when they get married for marriage counselling, is it?
I
know that's small beer, but it's $20 million for a trial. But it's the message, isn't it? Now's the time to get the budget under control. Now you are giving vouchers to newlyweds.
And the point I'd make is that through the Commission of Audit, we are having a very structured and systematic look across the government at
this one could go
at areas of expenditure.
So this could go.
But at the same time, there's obviously activity across all levels of government. Now, $20 million as a exercise in a particular area, which is really looking at the effectiveness of marriage and what you can do to help couples who are getting married to have a more successful marriage.
David, think about the economic consequences of failed marriages. $200 for a bit of counselling is very small beer compared to the economic consequences for families of a failed marriage and the broader consequences in the economy. I mean, absolutely.
Why even trial this then? Why not just spend $500 on every couple?
Let's keep this in context.
I know it's a very small amount, but it's just the message. You're there trying to sell the line that we've got to get the budget under control, and I agree with you on that.
But Commonwealth budget expenditure is heading towards $400 billion a year. It's a very substantial amount of money. And so there's systematic work going on at looking at every aspect of expenditure, and that's what we need to be looking at, the major systematic drivers of expenditure.
It seemed to me the better time to hand out free vouchers for marriage counselling, isn't it? first day of marriage, it's probably 10 years down the track. It's probably when you need it
Well,
more.
there are short marriage provisions in the Family Law Act for people who have marriages that fall apart in the first 2 years, and these vouchers really are designed to help those people who have to...
Back on the big picture, though, when it comes to getting the budget under control. We've heard Bill Shorten saying this week that you guys are going to be cooperative and you're not going to just say no for no's sake. How cooperative will you be? Are there areas that you think you could agree with the government on trimming spending?
In Australia, there's always a certain amount of bipartisan agreement. That's what keeps the country going. But look, I think we have some very curious rhetoric coming out of the government. So one minute we have this great austerity drive, and it risks shattering confidence. And we look at some of the decisions last year around jobs, GrainCorp, where they blocked investment, Holden, where they failed to secure investment. They're kind of they're well, there's an argument about that. But they're shilly-shallying about. I'm happy to have a federal inquiry,
we've done that.
To find out. But they're shilly-shallying around Qantas. 3 national icons. There's all this shilly-shallying. Doesn't match their rhetoric. And now this year they open up with the great austerity drive, and guess who's going to suffer? Well, it's disability pensioners and the unemployed. And what's likely to shatter economic
you're basing
confidence?
That on the announcement of a review into welfare.
Of kite flying by a minister. And then out of nowhere comes this bit of fairy floss around marriage counselling.
But let's just go to the real point.
Just let me finish. Just let me finish about the fairy floss, right? Because it's a very, very important thing. Because what this is just something that slipped through this amazing budget process and found its way onto the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And it's going to be quicker than most celebrity marriages. It won't last that long, a year. And apparently it's going to end divorce in this country.
The importance here is that the Commonwealth spends a very substantial amount of money on welfare each year. Now, all of us have a shared interest in having that spent as effectively as possible, and we do know that failed marriages, broken families, have a correlation
let me tell you something.
with welfare spending.
When poverty knocks at the door, love flies out the window. That's an old saying, and it's very, very true. So if you want to do something to stop divorce, focus on jobs, focus on hospitals,
are absolutely
focus on making
jobs.
sure kids can get to good schools.
You know how you get more jobs? You know how you get more
schools.
jobs? You get the private sector going, you take the burden off the private sector.
You don't do it by shattering economic
You reduce
confidence.
the mining tax, you take the mining tax away, you take the carbon tax away, you reduce red tape. All that is about getting the private sector engine moving again to create more prosperity and more jobs. So we are dead serious. We are dead serious about creating more jobs, and we are doing it through getting the private sector going, rather than this fairyland view of the Labor Party that government can solve everything and that government can just
why are you getting involved in divorce and people's marriage? If you don't think government can solve everything, why are you getting involved in people's marriages?
If you equip
the government does have a decision to make on industry support. Now, whether it's
very exciting finger pointing going on here. You sure you want to interrupt it?
Holden, they've decided not to pump more federal money into. Qantas, the noises they're making are that they're not going to there either, and there's SPC as well. Is this the right approach for the government to make it clear to industry that this sort of corporate welfare, as it's sometimes called, and I'm sure you'll bristle at that suggestion, but is that the right approach, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest problem that we have at the moment, and even the neo-Keynesians should agree with this if they've read their textbooks, is that you do need to return the budget to surplus over the economic cycle, which basically in simple terms means another crash of some kind will come at some point, whether it's a tech wreck or a dot bubble or whatever the next thing will be. And at the next time that we need to have some fat to pay for some stimulus, you have to have that fat available, and we don't right now. Right now we've got some debts. So there does need to be cutting, and it does. Every dollar that the government spends instead of the private sector tends to have a dead weight loss component. It's going to be more effective to kickstart the economy if more dollars are in private hands. And I agree that if you want to save marriages, making sure people have jobs is absolutely the best way to make sure that people's families stay together. In terms of the foreign investment, absolutely, letting foreigners invest in Qantas will be the best solution to Qantas's problems at the moment. I mean, a lot of people say we have to prop up Qantas because foreign countries prop up their airlines. Well, I'm quite happy to have my travels subsidised by other countries. What I don't want to do is pay for somebody else's travel.
And I see you nodding on that one, Paul Fletcher. You happy to remove the foreign ownership restrictions?
Well, look, you know, Joe Hockey said last year that this was a question that needed to be looked at.
He in fact said, or indicated strongly that would be his preference.
And, you know, Qantas management makes the argument that they're subject to some competitive constraints because of the ownership restrictions, yet they are competing against very big players from around the world who don't have similar constraints. So is that a question that should be seriously looked at? In my view, yes, it is.
So you're...
Well, aren't you the government? Aren't you supposed to be looking at it? I mean, you know, you're acting like you're a commentator.
As you would know, Nick, there are processes in government, and the question is looked at by the responsible part of government. Now, I'm a parliamentary secretary with no portfolio responsibility in this area.
He's a powerful man, Paul Fletcher, but I think this decision will...
I can refer you to the comments of the Treasurer.
Yeah. But you'll be one of those, I'm guessing, within the government who's pretty happy to see the tap turned off when it comes to any form of industry assistance.
Well, look, the key point is this. In terms of industry assistance, the objective, obviously, is Australia's prosperity and jobs. And so, therefore, that's what you need to test against. And so...
So that's a difficult thing, though, because... there is a lot of taxpayer support for tourism, for science, research, and
mining,
pharmaceuticals, all sorts of industries get billions of dollars. So where do you draw the line?
And there's plenty of support for science and research, and the whole area of innovation policy is one that I think is of great importance. Now, the economic argument...
The manufacturers,
the economic argument for support for research and development is that it's a public good. In other words, money that goes into research, particularly basic research, the returns on that can't be captured by any one private sector player. So the economic theory says, therefore, there's a good case for public money going into research. And if you believe that we are increasingly a knowledge economy and that the world is increasingly a knowledge economy and that the returns to innovation are greater than ever, then clearly policy in that area is of importance.
So manufacturing doesn't fit that description?
Oh, look, the notion that manufacturing is, is rust-built and can't be high-tech is certainly not correct. Certainly not correct, and R&D is as important in manufacturing as anywhere else.
All right. Does anyone disagree with that general approach of where to pump taxpayers' money into?
One more comment, which is that sometimes the best thing the government can do is to stop doing anything at all. And the current Red Tape Repeal Day proposal, which is a terrific idea, gives us a chance to save government time and money by stopping interfering with the activities of private citizens and businesses and letting them get on with their job. And I think wherever government can save costs by saving other people time and trouble, that's got to be a great place to look. It's easy for people to talk about the marginal things in public spending, such as marriage vouchers, which attract attention, but they're actually quite small beer.
But you got some big ones there too coming, like the paper and leave scheme. And yes, there's a slug on big companies to pay for that, but nonetheless, it's money coming out of the economy going back into the economy.
It's a productivity measure and about improving workplace participation for women, particularly skilled women in whom, as a nation, we've invested a lot of money for education.
So why does every business leader say this is a bad idea?
Well, that's a question you'd have to ask them. But in terms of the rationale for it, it's about productivity and improving workplace participation, particularly from women with significant skills. I mean, the more you can get highly skilled women in the workforce, rather than their skills not being drawn on for economic purposes, then the better that is from an economic perspective.
Let's move away from the economy. I want to ask you, in particular, Paul Fletcher, about one of your portfolio areas. You're the Parliamentary Secretary to the Communications Minister, and you're in talks with the big social media companies, Twitter, Facebook, Google, about online bullying, and in particular of kids. And this is a growing problem for a lot of kids out there, and a lot of families will have some familiarity with it. Explain to us exactly what you're proposing here.
So this week we've issued a discussion paper calling for comment on 3 measures. First of all, establishing what we're going to call a Children's E-Safety Commissioner. So this will be a central point within the Commonwealth Government to take policy responsibility for online safety for children. The second thing is a rapid removal scheme, a complaint scheme for harmful content, cyberbullying directed at children on large social media sites, with a view to getting that down quickly, because it's clear when you talk to parents, when you talk to kids, cyberbullying is a serious problem.
So the plan here is if a kid is copping abuse online and this government official decides that it's too much.
Well, the notion is, first of all, that you complain to the social media sites.
Well, okay, but who raises this to the attention of? Well,
then
is it the child?
Either the child or a parent or guardian.
Often the parents don't know, do they?
That's certainly true. That is an issue. So this is about what we say in the discussion paper is, and that we're calling for comment on, is that the child ought to be able to make the complaint, or a parent or guardian or teacher or other adult on behalf of the child, so that that should go first to the large social media site.
So Twitter, for example, you'd go to them and say, can you block all of this or stop all of this? And you'd hope 9 times out of 10 they will.
The large sites typically do have a complaint system, but it's their own terms of use which determines.
And if they say no,
then at the moment,
free space. At
the moment, there is no redress. Now, one thing I should make clear is one of the questions we seek comment on is how do you define a large social media site and which sites would be included.
And that's going to be ever-changing.
Indeed, and so you'd need to have a regime which recognises that sites move up and down, and years ago MySpace was the big one, and then it largely disappeared.
What is everyone else?
Can I just say, 1/3 element of that is looking at whether we need a simplified cyberbullying offence, including one of the things we proposed and sought comment on is a civil penalty regime, which is similar to what they're proposing to do in New Zealand. So
what are the penalties involved for that?
Well, to be determined, but relatively modest. You don't necessarily want to be hitting a child who turns out to be bullying with the full criminal law.
If a 12-year-old kid's been bullying someone, but there would be a penalty.
That's right. And also then the notion is you go to that child and say, well, look, you've been saying some very bad things about somebody else. You could be up for a penalty here. Maybe you should take that down.
Does everyone think that's a good idea?
Cyberbullying is clearly a huge issue.
It's a growing issue.
But I think a lot of the major responsibility for cyberbullying, and I understand, Paul, getting it off the site is very important, is actually at the parent stage, and the parents talking to their kids about appropriate and inappropriate behaviour and the effect that
the parents usually don't know.
Look, I think that is true. There is no doubt that.
Well, when it comes to the bullying, right? If your child is the one doing the bullying.
Oh yeah, nobody's child is the bully, right?
But that's what I mean.
But can I just say, I mean, Julian is right, but what this is about is supporting parents, teachers and others with the tools they need. It's very clear, for example, that schools face a significant burden now, which they didn't perhaps even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago, in dealing with...
Does all of this sound like pretty good stuff?
Look, it all sounds fine, but the only point I'd make is, well, look, we live in an open, interconnected world, and that's accelerating. And for young people, it's even quicker, and they're even more integrated in this new world. And I think there is a limit. This is just a practical limit to how much assurance governments can give to parents, and there's a limit parents can do, and there's a limit that individuals can do. So I think we're probably better off equipping people with the skills how to deal with it, rather than putting in place, and the previous government tried it as well, putting in place sort of, bureaucratic mechanisms to protect people. I'm not being critical of Paul, I think his policy work's quite sound, but we do have to make sure that the overall sort of framework is, look, it's an open, connected world, and you'll have to make your way through it.
Can I just say, I think Nick makes some very fair points there. Part of what we have committed to as well in the policy we took to the last election was to spend $7.5 million funding training programs within schools, so typically not educators coming in from outside the school but specialists in the area of cyber safety, helping to equip the kids with the skills they need, because you're right, digital citizenship, including understanding risks and responding to them, is key for today's children, but it's also key to them being skilled and confident users of the internet and technology, because that's their future.
I disagree slightly with this party. I have 2 kids who've had unrestricted access to the internet since they could use a computer, which is when they were 2. And I'm constantly surrounded by school material and material coming from the media trying to tell me to get worried about things and trying to tell me that everybody else is worried about them. My children have never had any negative experiences online. Most of them don't use Facebook because Facebook is for old people. If you can police Reddit, good luck to you. You know, I respect your intentions here. But I'm quite concerned with the direction that some of this is headed in the UK, where people are now being policed and arrested and charged for things they put on Twitter and Facebook. And children have to be taught the responsibilities that come with free speech, but taking an overly legalistic approach to the activities of children risks, I think, us getting down some quite difficult unintended consequences.
Well, we've got to move on. But yeah, what to do about online bullying and where to draw the line? I guess some similar questions about drunken idiots and what to do about that. After the break, we'll look at the alcohol-related violence issues that have been around and some of the suggestions and actions being taken. Stay with us.
There are infinite ways to travel the world. Let Zuji be your finder and you'll get the flights and hotels you're looking for. Your perfect trip is waiting for you. Book online at zuji.com.au.
I'm Ben Grills and I've been challenged to find the key ingredients in Nature's Own Joint Enhanced Plus Krill. Scientifically developed formulation of krill chondroitin, a natural component in cartilage and glucosamine. Found a shellfish like this. This triple combination helps temporarily relieve arthritic joint pain. That keeps you moving. A lot more than just nature goes into Nature's Own.
Every one of our 15,000 products comes with a guarantee. Like this pencil, this tablet, even these sticky notes.
Find a cheaper identical stocked item and we'll beat it by 5%.
Well, that's a good idea.
If you've got the big ideas, Officeworks has the lowest prices.
All over the world, our card members are saying yes to faster rewards. Last year, we helped them enjoy over 14 million great experiences. Just part of the more rewarding service we deliver daily. American Express. Realise the potential.
Welcome to Progressive, where we're 100% online.
What's that?
We call it the bundler. Let's say you need insurance on a couple of cars. We put them together on one policy and you get a discount on both.
Wow, 2 in 1. How'd you think of that?
Just came to us.
What?
Visit progressiveonline.com.au to bundle your cars and save.
Wherever you choose to escape to, we can take you there. Now for a limited time on selected Volvo XC90, XC60 and V40 cross-country models, the drive-away price is reduced by the GST amount. All the adventure, minus the GST. Make your escape for less.
Thinning hair. If hair growth is waning, more and more men choose the caffeine shampoo by Alpecin. During hair washing, Alpecin penetrates the hair follicle. Caffeine shampoo by Alpecin for noticeably thicker hair.
Today, Trafalgar invited us to Jean-Pierre and Evelyn's home.
Everyone got a kiss.
This family run a vineyard that just took us all in.
And we spent a day sitting under a beautiful big tree. Sun was shining, great food, and the wine was magic.
Experiencing this local secret, completely hidden away, was just amazing.
Book your Trafalgar holiday now and save up to $1,270 per couple. Visit trafalgar.com or call your travel agent today.
Welcome back. We're talking tonight to Liberal MP Paul Fletcher, Julian Leeser, the former head of the Menzies Research Centre, Cass Wilkinson from the Centre for Independent Studies, and Labor MP Nick Champion. I want to turn to the what's been another big issue of the week and really of the summer, and that is this alcohol-related violence, although some have argued of the link between alcohol and violence. The violence, anyway, has seen, sadly, in recent times, 2 young men killed on the streets of Sydney after these one-punch attacks. A lot of other brawls and incidents in George Street, in the King's Cross area and other parts of the CBD. This week, the Premier, Barry O'Farrell, announced some pretty tough measures, went further than most expected. Lockouts late at night, mandatory minimum sentences. Doctors groups, the AMA today, saying there should be further steps taken at a national level, increasing alcohol taxes, further restrictions on advertising of alcohol. Cass, what do you think about all of this? Because it's not just going to affect the idiots, it's going to affect all of us when you put these restrictions on.
So I guess first thing to say is I really welcome the extra policing and the late night public transport. I was involved.
You should point out you live in the inner city.
Yeah, and I live in the area that's covered, and I'm involved in venues and music organisations in the area that's covered, and I have a great many friends who own music clubs in the area that's covered. And I think all of us welcome the late night public transport and policing, which we've been arguing for a long time, as has pretty much everyone in the area. What we are concerned about is that Sydney used to be a sleepy town, and a lot of people put a lot of work into making this a place that is a 24-hour global city, and there are plenty of clubs full of law-abiding, harmless, responsible adults that don't really kick off till 11 o'clock at night and do not slow down till 5 o'clock in the morning.
And they have a lot of staff too, I would imagine, that are going to now be out of
And we're talking
out of a job.
about some of the people who have now been speaking up in the last couple of days are the DJs, they're the performers, they are the door people, the bartenders. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people's livelihoods and thousands of people's enjoyment is going to be curtailed. A lot of people will probably go out of business because of this.
But is that, sadly, the price to pay to end what has been clearly a problem?
Well, there's clearly a problem. It's not clear that the problem is the venues. Dr Don Weatherburn of the Bureau of Crime Statistics has put out press releases around this showing that assaults in the area generally have come down. It's been pointed out...
The number of assaults, I think, but the ferocity of each one...
And the tragedy for all of us at the moment is that these particularly vicious assaults are not a generalised problem, they are an acute problem for which nobody's quite sure they have the answer yet. And throwing some energy at every idea that's been canvassed seems to be the approach. They have essentially put out in that press release every idea that anybody had about this problem without thinking about all of the people who it will affect.
What does everyone else think, though, about this issue? Paul Fletcher, do you support the extra government restrictions that are being put in place?
Well, it's clearly a set of policy responsibilities for the New South Wales State Government. I think Barry O'Farrell has shown strong leadership this week, and I congratulate him on that. And obviously, at a federal government level, we share the concern that I think most Australians have at the evidence that there is a significant culture of binge drinking.
But would you go as far as the AMA suggesting an increased taxes on alcohol, the price of alcohol, to try and stem this? Well, look, the AMA has put some suggestions forward, and we all have to acknowledge the terrific work, the very difficult work done by doctors and other medical personnel. What do you think about this idea? Around Australia? Well, look, this is an environment where lots of ideas are being put forward. From a federal government point of view, let's continue to have an evidence-based look at the range of policies in this area. So you're just not too sure on that one? Well, certainly I think what is a good thing is that you have a range of stakeholders putting forward perspectives and throwing in policy ideas. What about you, Nick Champion?
Well, look, I think there should be a national summit. I think the AMA's call for a national summit is sensible. I don't necessarily, think that we should kind of punish everybody because of a few individuals, and these individuals have been around. I remember going out and drinking in my teens and in my 20s and witnessing some pretty savage king hits on occasion, and on the footy field as well. And
was alcohol always a factor?
Not always. I mean, there are some people who want to go out for a fight. They don't drink at all. They just go out to have a brawl.
And there's a lot of people
and those people need to be dealt with by courts. I'm not sure.
This is the thing, and there's a lot of people who do get drunk and aren't violent.
There's no problems. And I would support courts being tough on certain individuals. I'm not sure mandatory sentencing is actually the best way of getting that outcome, because you inevitably have a couple of lads who just having a blue. Get caught up in that and maybe go to jail for 8 years. So we've got to be, I suppose, cautious not to have sort of an hysterical response, but we do need to have a response. And my concern is, look, in every city there is a street, whether it be King's Cross or Hindley Street in Adelaide, which becomes, at a certain point in the night, virtually ungovernable for police. That is, that they cannot police a place. No matter how many numbers you put in, because there are so many people, such a level of intoxication, and there is great potential for conflict because of the numbers out.
Should it be that way? I mean, should there be any areas that are ungovernable?
Well, and that's where I think that we have to listen to police in particular about how we manage those spaces, because they are very volatile.
The solution, or one of the things that I think we should be thinking about in this space, is not so much the national approach, but much more localised approaches in places. Where the Premier was, I think, today or yesterday, he was in Manly, and he talked about the way in which the hotels in Manly, the local mayor, the businesses, the police, all got together and realised there was a problem a few years ago, and did some simple things like moving the cab rank so it was right outside the hotel. Hotels are changing. We all remember when there were a bunch of hotels that were unfriendly biker pubs that have become family hotels now.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there, I'm afraid. We do have to go now live, and I'll thank you all for joining us tonight. We're going to take you live now to Davos in Switzerland. The Prime Minister, Tony